Think about your day. Wake up, check your phone, work, eat, scroll, sleep, repeat. Now imagine stripping all of that away, no job, no phone, no schedule, and ask yourself, what did a person actually do with an entire day 40,000 years ago? The honest answer surprises most people. It wasn't 12 hours of desperate survival, and it wasn't some peaceful, endless vacation either. Let's start with the biggest myth, that early humans were constantly working just to stay alive, every waking hour. Research on modern hunter-gatherer societies has consistently found something surprising. Groups like the Hadza in Tanzania and the Akung in the Kalahari typically spend around 3 to 6 hours a day on actual subsistence work. Not 12, not 16. A number that, on paper, looks a lot like a modern part-time job. That statistic alone rewrites a lot of assumptions. Early humans likely had a genuinely significant amount of unstructured time every single day. So what filled those hours? A day probably started early with first light, since artificial lighting didn't exist. The morning was typically when the actual subsistence work happened, a hunting party heading out or a foraging group moving through the landscape. Foraging required an enormous, detailed mental map which plants were edible, which were poisonous, where water reliably appeared. This knowledge had to be learned, remembered, and passed down, meaning a huge amount of early human work was actually closer to expertise, not brute labor. By midday, activity often slowed. Heat made hard physical activity inefficient and risky. This is when a lot of rest, shade-seeking, and lower effort tasks happened: tool maintenance, food processing, childcare, mending. And this is where the picture gets genuinely interesting, because a surprising amount of early human time went toward things that weren't survival tasks at all. Toolmaking required patience, skill, and often teaching, meaning older group members spent real time instructing younger ones, education embedded directly into daily life. Social time sitting, talking, storytelling took up a substantial chunk of the day. Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have found that evening conversation is disproportionately taken up by storytelling, gossip, and social bonding, not practical survival information. That detail matters more than it sounds like. A huge amount of what made early human groups successful wasn't just physical survival skill, it was social skill. There was also genuinely downtime in the modern sense, rest, play, and idle time that served no obvious immediate function. Children in hunter-gatherer societies studied today spend large amounts of time in unstructured play, which researchers argue builds cooperative and problem-solving skills. Adults, too, had periods of simply resting or socializing with no task attached at all, closer to what you might now call leisure. Evenings tended to center on fire. Once the sun went down, activity outside the group's protected space became dangerous, so the group gathered close. Fire wasn't just warmth and safety. It created a fixed, shared social space at the same time every day. Some researchers argue this was one of the most important social technologies early humans ever had. It guaranteed the entire group would be together, awake, and talking at the same point every day. So the honest shape of an early human's day: a few focused hours of skilled work, meaningful rest during the heat of midday, real time on teaching and childcare, and evenings built around fire, food, and conversation. Not a desperate scramble for survival every waking hour. Not a peaceful vacation either. Something closer to a very physical, very social, tightly bonded version of a normal working day. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Modern humans, on average, work more scheduled hours per week than most studied hunter-gatherer societies ever did. All of our tools and technology were supposed to buy us more free time. For a huge portion of human history, in a much simpler way, we may have already had it.